Okay, hi. We're gonna keep this moving. So if you could settle down, please. Thank you so much. Um, After Kuwait, we now move to another intriguing, perhaps lesser known, but also highly influential, kind of strange triangulation of dates, actors, and agents. I guess one of the premises of the Global Art Forum is to take the kind of actuality of where we are in the world, both in time and space, here in Dubai, here in the UAE, here in the Gulf, and to extrapolate various forms of geography and history that have impacted where we are now. And in that sense, it gives me great pleasure to welcome Michael Vazquez. Michael writes and talks about food, art, music, religion, and magazines. He's senior editor of Bidoun, Art and Culture from the Middle East, and he's former editor, and this is very important, of Transition magazine, which is an international review. He's currently guest curator for the Politics of Food residency at the Delphina Foundation in London. The session has been called 1966, Extremely Soft Power, or Trajectories of the Sudanese Gulf. And we're going to learn about the triangulation between Sudan, the CIA, and the Gulf. So will you please join in welcoming Michael Vazquez. Thank you.
Is this working? It is now. I like the meanwhile on the screen, but let's see if this is functional. Well, yes. Okay. Wow, sorry. So I am also, sorry, do I, Schumann? Oh, the timer started. Okay, great. That's great. I was unable, so I'm going to, I wished that I could have worked it out so I could get the images up here, but it was a little bit complicated. But so the image that we're going to start with while I narrate part of the story is of Ibrahim Salahi, the painter, on the left, and Tayeb Salih, the writer, who knew each other their entire lives and were friends from university and whose careers together, actually, they are two trajectories which followed along very similarly and which tell us a lot. Well, they tell a story, which is the story I'm going to tell. I was hoping to find an image. Actually, it turned out that Ibrahim Salahi also was an actor in the film version of one of Tayeb Salih's novels, which was produced in Kuwait in 1976. But that image is actually hard to track down. So what I'm talking about today actually relates to sort of two distinct projects. One of them is this thing that I was calling extremely soft power, but which is about one of these elliptical historical moments. And the other is better known but still actually understood, and which is about the history of cultural diplomacy and literature and art and culture and the role of the Cold War and various entities in actually producing what I'm going to suggest is some of the most indispensable things that we know. And this is one of the ellipses, is that there are many things that you might not know or have any idea that were produced in this particular way, and that's something that's going to come up. Also, just in the interest of time, because it's short, I'm going to lead with what might have been the punchline, which is I'm going to talk about the Sudanese in the Gulf. And this is a thing which came out actually of, so Ibrahim Salahi had a show at the Tate Modern last summer, which was the first major retrospective of an African painter in the history of the Tate. It's It was an amazing show. Visionary Modernism was the title, but in the course, it had a lot of his works, many of which were quite monumental. It also had vitrines filled with the material culture by which his work entered into the systems, actually into the international art world. He came into the art world in the early 1960s, and he came through various publications. This is also one of the sort of elliptical things that I'm interested in about the production of culture, which is that the apparatus of culture, which is publications, prints, exhibitions, networks, people, relationships, are things that without which famous books or works or shows would not exist, but there's usually only one name attached or one object. So for example, Tayeb Salih, who wrote a book called Season of Migration of the North, which I'll talk about in a second, that book was published to all accounts in 1969. Actually 68 in Arabic and 69 in English. But there's a history behind that, and the history behind that is what allows that book to even become something that you can know about or read or talk about later. So it was in the course of that show, one of the things that is documented in that show, as I will come to, was the element of the Congress for Cultural Freedom, which was an organization founded in Paris in 1950, devoted to promoting free cultural expression and a variety of other ideas, including jazz music and abstract painting, or non-objective painting, as they called it at the time. And the scientific spirit and a variety of things, but also primarily designed to appeal to left-wing anti-communists, which there were a sizable population, and in part also because immediately after World War II, the idea that there was going to be a cultural Cold War and that it was going to be fought between the non-communist left. There was no right. The right was discredited by fascism, so the war was actually between the left, and it was between the communist left and the non-communist left. The communist left, the non-communist left, many of them were actually former communists themselves. So there is actually also a kind of a psychodrama that attaches to all of this. The other thing that you realize, so when you, in this show, you see these journals. Black Orpheus is a journal, the first major literary magazine in Africa in English, founded in the late 50s, which is where Ibrahim Salahi gets his first appearance and is profiled by the editor-in-chief. And then actually his first show is in Ibadan at the Mbari Club, organized by the editor of Black Orpheus. And then the next show after that is in Calcutta, which happens in part because of the connections of the guy in Ibadan. And then the next show is in London at the ICA. And the show in London at the ICA happens through the offices of something called the Transcription Center, which was based on Dover Street, 2 doors down from the Arts Club, which was a clearinghouse for African writers and artists who, in a kind of Hans Ulrich Obristian fashion, were interviewed serially every time they came to London. So there is a kind of accretion of the history of the process of writers and artists that is documented in the Transcription Center archives, which actually are findable online, I think, if you have university access. Anyway, the punchline to this, for me, was, because I know much of this history for reasons that Schumann alluded to, and I will come back to, but often, almost every time that Tayeb Salih wrote something, it appeared in one of these magazines, and it was illustrated by his friend, Ibrahim Salahi. And Tayeb Salih's final story, the stories that became his final novel, appeared after the collapse of this network of patronage that the Congress for Cultural Freedom organized. And that story appeared in Doha magazine, which I had never heard of. And in fact, everyone I spoke to had no idea that there had been a Doha magazine that had published. Season of Migration of the North, Edward Said called it one of the 6 pivotal novels in the Arabic language. It was published in the Heinemann African Writers series. It's actually one of my favorite books, but it's been translated into 30 languages. even though it had appeared in a journal that was politically suspect, it was immediately published in Cairo. Basically, it was it became the patrimony of everyone almost immediately. And that writer's final novel appeared in this journal in Doha in 1977. And then in the course of following up on that, of course, I realized that Tayeb Salih and Ibrahim Salahi both lived in Doha in the 1970s. And in fact, they were both employed by the Ministry of Information and Culture. In fact, I think Tayeb Salih was the Minister of Culture at one point. And in fact, and this is the thing that then explains one slightly obscure part of the Ibrahim Salahi show, he actually lived there from 1976 when he was actually also in the Ministry of Culture in Sudan for a time and then jailed. And when he got out, he moved to Doha and lived there for 20 years and worked for the Ministry of Culture. I'm going to come back to that in a second. Anyway, but the point is that this was my entree to the discovery, and this was a conversation actually. As I was having this, I had the fortune to be, I was shown around the exhibition by Salahi in the company of Sheikh Hiwar from Sharjah, who, when I was kind of dumbfounded and amazed by the story, she was like, actually, you know, all of my dad's advisors are Sudanese. This story actually, and when I began speaking to other people, they were like, oh yeah, we've always wondered what is up with these Sudanese figures who seem to be mysteriously high-placed, but there is no story about it. And in fact, last night I learned from Schumann that you can't call him the mayor because that structure does not exist, but the Director General of Dubai Municipality from 1961 until 1985 was a Sudanese figure who I think still lives in Dubai. But this is basically, I feel like, in the manner in which there is a lot of concern about how to narrate and think about the history of the Gulf. The Sudanese, the sort of soft power of the Sudanese and their role in quietly and in some ways invisibly administering the state at the sort of crucial moment of its first independent articulation is very little talked about. For me, as someone who is a magazine editor and a writer and very interested, because I engage in sometimes invisible work, I find this subject really compelling. And the Doha magazine, which is of course in Arabic and nearly impossible to find. So unfortunately, I have some images that I'll be showing of a few other things. I do not have images from Doha magazine. Well, I have, you'll see in a second. I'm glad I started with Sudan because, in fact, there is almost no time. But so anyway, so you have the basic picture. The thing about the Sudanese in the Gulf, well, I think I've told you what you need to know for now. And if we can make it to the questions, then we can come back to that. I just wanted to talk a little bit what I was saying before about 1966, which relates to this question of sort of the hidden hinges or pivot moments in history. 1966 was an incredibly important year in the Cold War, in the cultural Cold War in particular. It was the year that the Battle of Algiers was released, which was a very seminal film. This is also not just culture, it was in January, the Tricontinental Congress in Havana really set a new tone and established Cuba as one of the sort of leading intellectual lights across the non-aligned world. It's the sort of the shift from non-alignment to socialist resistance really was triggered by that, and a publication called Tricontinental, which was again very influential, was door-dropped on college campuses across the Third World, and which had a sort of Solidarity of the Month Club poster produced by designers who had been part of the film units. So this is the Solidarity with Palestine poster, which is one of the most iconic to me. Every one of the solidarity posters involved some sort of expected or folkloric image and a gun, but always a small arm that might be used by a guerrilla, not something that was artillery. But these images are really incredible, represent a real break with the sort of socialist, realist, communist aesthetic that had really sort of dominated in various ways or been modified slightly in China, but there was really something new that happened in Cuba that tricontinental was sort of the finest expression of, and this sort of aesthetic also ended up being influential in Lebanon, in Beirut, not long after. This is just, I wanted to counterpose though, so if you had an axis of cultural production that was happening basically with Soviet and Cuban subsidy, you had a really vast array of publications and exhibitions and galleries and whatnot that were being supported by the Congress for Cultural Freedom in Paris. And the magazines, which I am partial to, were doing this. For example, Mundo Nuevo is a magazine that was founded in August of 1966. Mundo Nuevo, if you look for sort of near the bottom, you'll see that 100 Years of Solitude by Gabriel Garcia Marquez appears first in Mundo Nuevo and is actually serialized in Mundo Nuevo. And part of the way that 100 Years of Solitude and sort of magic realism and the writing of the boom becomes an international literary phenomenon is through the publication in journals like Mundo Nuevo, and then their sort of recirculation of those texts. Another journal, so this is the journal that I edited Reincarnation of, that was based in North America, but this was a magazine from Uganda, founded in 1961, and I just put some images from 1966. Transition, I think this is, do magazines make an impression on culture? Transition was slightly juvenile and really forward-looking in its, well, in the fun that it took, actually. There were very few magazines being produced at this time in this, well, it had a sort of, it owed in some ways, I'm gonna stop. I love, because actually it just sort of makes the point if I show the more image. Does America love Africa too little, too much? Not yet, see page 11. This actually is for John. This is, Transition at times had incredible timing, so a very contrary, controversial, and perverse essay about Kwame Nkrumah, which was titled Nkrumah the Leninist Tsar, which the author claimed was meant to be merely descriptive, that he was both royalist in his trappings and Leninist in his political organization. And then this is an Encounter, which actually had been around since the early 50s. Encounter was the flagship journal of the Congress for Cultural Freedom. It was based in London. It was founded in some ways to attempt to get English people to think that Americans were less stupid, actually, that there was sort of culture being produced in America and thinking being produced in America, and that there would be some sort of conversation, and that this was going to be crucial if there was going to be a NATO and there was going to be a Cold War, and that the Americans were going to be taken seriously, as well as for something besides their arms and budgets. So Encounter is actually where the first, this is from 1966. You'll see a handful of dates by Tayeb Salih. And the first two appearances in English, and basically until his novels are published, Tayeb Salih exists in English through Encounter. Now, and then this is Hiwar. Hiwar Dialogue, which is the journal that the Congress for Cultural Freedom published in Beirut, and started in 1962. Founded by a Palestinian Christian modernist poet, translator of T.S. Eliot, somewhat perverse figure himself, named Tawfiq Saig. My pronunciation is, apologize for its atrociousness. This is Tawfiq Saig. I think, looking soulful, and then beneath one of his own self-portraits. I do just want to mention, basically, that the reason why this is where this is all coming together, I believe, in that Hiwar was immediately controversial, was immediately lauded, engaged. What a lot of these Congress for Cultural Freedom magazines did was actually debate themselves, and had fairly vibrant letters pages, and also articles would generate counter articles, and sort of they had a very organic culture. Hiwar has two, it actually had many, many points, but the two that I want to point out were, I need to scroll down. Actually, there's three things. One, Tawfiq Saig himself published many of his poems in his journal. There is one which has been called the strangest poem in Arabic literature, which was meant as a compliment, called A Few Questions I Posed to the Unicorn. In 1963, Hiwar published a short story by the radical feminist writer Leila Balbaki called Spaceship of Tenderness to the Moon. Spaceship of Tenderness to the Moon then was the title of a short story collection that she released later that year, which led to her being arraigned for obscenity and offense to public morals. Which is also to say that this Hiwar was the sort of magazine that would publish that purposefully and actually sort of court that sort of controversy, but also because they were dear friends, and it's not just controversy for its own sake. If you look actually at this writer who, in the wake of that encounter with the state, stopped writing, she's definitely another elliptical figure that is worth recovery. But the other important thing is that in 1966, again, Season of Migration of the North by Tayeb Salih appeared in its entirety in the pages of Hiwar. And not least because, for one thing, that Season of Migration of the North, if you don't know, is an incredible book. It's a crime story. It's been called Heart of Darkness in Reverse. It's the story of a sort of Sudanese intellectual, the sort of best and the brightest, goes to London, becomes a professor at the London School of Economics, sleeps his way through various well-meaning white girls in London, leaving a trail of suicides behind him. He plays a kind of, to seduce women, he plays up the sort of oriental savage fantasy, appeals to everyone's basest nature, finally meets someone who gets him, and then he murders her. And as you don't, as you should not. But that's kind of, I mean, I've actually just spoiled early part of the book or a middle part of the book for you, but that's actually not even the heart of the book. The heart of the book is about that character, Mustafa Said, going back to the town, the small town in Sudan, and the relationship between sort of another Western-educated figure who becomes obsessed with trying to find out who Mustafa Said is and what happened to him. But actually, the novel is incredible more for the color and the evocation of conversation, and also, I think, to sort of just come back to this point about why Hiwar was the sort of place that would publish that, or that would allow it to be published. Like a tenth of the book is a conversation between sort of 70-something elders from the village about sex, which is led by actually an 80-year-old woman who had divorced several husbands sort of for their sexual inadequacy. But it's a scene that I think you would not find, I had not found anywhere else in any context, and it's part of the thing that is incredible about the whole book and about his tone is that it is very gentle. It is the most gentle book about a serial killer you are likely to read. He's not a serial killer, he's a lady, anyway. But the point is, just to tie this up really inelegantly, is that So the story that the Congress for Cultural Freedom was actually being bankrolled by the CIA, bankrolled actually implies they were spending all the money, but the point is the Congress for Cultural Freedom would not have existed without the CIA and the Ford Foundation and Rockefeller and various other foundations and private individuals. That story, and this was a thing that almost all of the editors and writers and people involved did not know. The Congress for Cultural Freedom purported to be engaged in promoting cultural freedom, which had an agenda, obviously, but this was not known. And when this story came out, many of the journals, although not all, collapsed within a few years, and the editors basically faced personal and professional catastrophes. The editor of Transition was thrown in jail and really was broken by the experience. Tawfik Saig was hounded out of Beirut. It was not the best place to discover you were working for the CIA. And Tawfik Saig died in 1970, but then in some ways, I think the relationship between Tawfik Saig and Tayeb Salih was very, very important. And it's the absence of that relationship, which I think also leads to the diminution of Tayeb Salih's interest in writing or in publishing new work. Anyway, and then they go, I'm out of time, so I'm going to say, and then they went to Doha. But they went to Doha following a sort of mass migration, and the reason for that, there was the demand for Sudanese migrants in the Gulf actually was a reflection of the incredible, just to echo something from the Kuwait discussion, the University of Khartoum and many other schools in Sudan were incredible. Were some of the best in the region, by which I mean the region that we mean when we talk here, but also North and East Africa. Actually a very important English political scientist development figure, went to do a PhD in Khartoum in the early 80s still. So there was very, very good specialized knowledge. So doctors and lawyers and teachers from Sudan were very much in demand across the Gulf, as well as people who were going, and the money was certainly better. And the politics in Sudan were very difficult in the 60s. I mean, actually are difficult almost all the time. But there was a civil war in the 60s. Also, there was a coup, and there was a lot of political instability. So, do we have time for questions? I actually can't
Well,
tell.
this is it. I think all of us would like your perambulations to go on potentially forever. Unfortunately, time constraints don't allow that. But I would like to take maybe a couple of minutes and maybe invite actually Oscar and perhaps even John Akomfra, who's going to talk in a minute, whether you have comments or things, because I think there are very interesting kind of connections. I mean, Oscar's recent book, which is about the coup of Allende and around this date of 9th of September 73, but he has to go, you go back to the 60s. I wonder whether, perhaps if I could go to you, Oscar, first.
Fascinating stuff. But I was particularly taken by your contention that if we were to hark back the history of our present and the history of all those repressed hinges of history to the beginning of the 20th century, we would find ourselves in a very unfamiliar political territory because there is no right, as you put it correctly. There are anti-communist leftists and communist leftists. This was also the case in the Americas as a whole. What happens then? Why everything goes so wrong? Why is it that at some point, while the CIA is financing this cultural venture, they're also financing neo-fascist movements, not only in South America, but also elsewhere, with the terrible consequences for our time that we all know but do not speak of. It's very funny, but I wonder if you can elaborate on that a little bit more. And of course, then we'll have, I hope, the time to talk about the magazines. 'Cause,
Yeah.
That's one project that I would love to develop. You can almost tell the history of the 20th and the 21st century through magazines. It would be fantastic.
And I would actually, just to not actually answer the first question, but just to allude to something, I went to there was a really incredible show at the American Society. You can sit down if you want, but I could still see you. That was about it was like Jorge Luis Borges and Zul Solar, a friendship. And it was basically about the story of the writer and the artist, again, a sort of writer and the artist pair, who worked together all the time and who kept founding magazines. This is the sort of, particularly in Latin America, in the African context, there are journals being produced in response to each other, but it actually seems like in the early history of sort of modern writing in Latin America, everyone starts a journal every time they have a falling out with someone. So there's like this incredible proliferation of journals. Anyway, you can absolutely tell the history of modernism. And it's also a thing that disappears because even like Labyrinths by Borges is published in English. It's a book. It comes out in a date. It's as though it was written as a book. It's not written as a book. It's written as a series of interventions in particular moments in particular journals for particular reasons. Even as literature, literature is written for particular moments, to particular moments for particular reasons, and all that stuff disappears. As to what happened to the CIA, I think there are two things that happened, and actually this is, again, it's an extremely rich topic, but to talk about this transition, part of it is just that the 60s happen, or even like the sort of, the long 60s, sort of the beginning. But so you have the move from independence to liberation. There are sort of many moments that happen. You also have the hardening of the apartheid state. Like the moment of independence for so many African countries is also the moment of the imposition of apartheid. So you have basically I would say, you have a heightening of contradictions, and the CIA culture program, which is, it's actually kind of very unfair to call it the CIA culture program. But that project is a little bit overtaken by events, I think is one thing that happens. The other thing that happens, and I had a lot of my interest in this subject because I was editing this journal, Transition, which had a wellspring of well-wishers from the 60s who still read it and would sort of send me notes. So Dennis Brutus, who is this really important South African poet and athlete, actually, and sort of, but who led a sort of athlete ban for apartheid. Dennis Brutus would sort of write me all the time. I went out to dinner with Daniel Bell, who is the author of The Coming of Post-Industrial Society and The End of Ideology and all these books. And I actually asked this question, and Daniel Bell was like, the thing you have to understand about the CIA is it's a bureaucracy. It employed thousands of people. Many of them disagreed, and many of them were resentful of each other's budgets. And it turns out that when the story of the Congress for Cultural Freedom breaks, it breaks because people who always thought it was incredibly ridiculous to be spending this money on culture leak that story in an attempt to basically shut the thing down, because they're like, why is this one of the biggest parts of our budget? So that's one answer. That's two answers.
Well, slightly reluctant to do this because I know this is going to eat into our time, but two observations real quick. I'm fascinated by your holding up of 66 as this moment of aesthetic and cultural renewal. It also happens to be the date of massive political convulsions across the continent, because as you know, the overthrow of Nkrumah was in February. Tafawa Balewa's overthrow in Nigeria was a couple of months later. So it's also, many have pondered what the connections are between those two. I mean, just a statement, because I know we can talk about it. But the thing that I'm much more fascinated with in your talk is this. Many of us came across the history of CIA patronage that you're talking about through a very cantankerous figure from the 80s and 90s called Peter Fuller. Peter Fuller was an art historian who first started to talk about this. Now, in the Fullerian universe, that dissociation necessarily taints the work so much, in particular abstract expressionism, that it makes it suspect at best or worthless, at worst. Now, I'm interested to engage you on what you think those ethical conundrums mean for transition in particular, let's say. I mean, can we make the Fullerian argument, or is the Fullerian argument too naive a way of approaching the value of transition, for instance?
So I would say the first thing, which is not, even when I proposed this subject as a 1966 as a thing, the pitch actually was half, the beginnings of the Nigerian Civil War, the overthrow of Nkrumah. Because 66, actually, my idea was that 66 is more important than 68. 68 is like more cinematic and happens in Europe, but 66 actually is, and I mean, again, you can really go on, and there's stuff I haven't even put back together for this, because, and this is the thing, I edited Transition for a really long time, kind of a while ago. I myself went through, I feel like, the many stages of grief, anger, and then a little bit of acceptance, actually, which sort of gets to the second thing that you're talking about. I kept finding, I initially was like, even like, does what happened to transition in the 60s compromise transition being revived and becoming a thing that I'm even working with? Not before, I was very young when I started doing it. But then once I found out about it, I was like, well, that's appalling. But then the thing that I have to say that really, and it continues to happen to me, even like until 3 years ago, I didn't know that Tayeb Salih, I didn't know about Hiwar. And I certainly did not know that without Hiwar, and I've more recently learned even specifically the role of Tawfiq Sayegh goading Tayeb Salih into writing, which he hated doing. And I have some of my favorite writers that I've worked with are the same person. So it's even like I identify, I keep finding, the thing that keeps happening to me is that I identify with the people who are producing these journals, because I find myself feeling exactly knowing what they're going through. Also, even like, to relate a little bit specifically to the way that the sort of funding of the CIA stuff worked, if any of you are involved in nonprofits or have ever received money from a foundation, you know that the way that foundations work is they give you money for a specific purpose, and you have to then spend a lot of time accounting for how you spent the money that sort of goes back to their specific purpose, and you sometimes have to make stuff up so that you can get the money that you may not have wanted to do in the first place. When the Congress for Cultural Freedom, or in particular its grant-making body, the Farfield Foundation, which is, if I were the CIA and I were going to make the name of foundation, Farfield, is incredible. Wow, I can't even say their name without summoning. But Farfield would give you money and you could spend it on anything you wanted. I mean, they didn't give you a ton. It really was like, I wanna send a writer from East Africa to South Africa to write a story. And Farfield would give you money. Or Black Orpheus. Black Orpheus starts out on its own. Black Orpheus, at a certain point, Uli Baer is like, I want to pay my writers, because I've never paid anybody, I don't have money. And he got a budget to start paying the writers. So it's, basically for me, I actually do think it's naive. And then also, to me, it's like this is not only happening, I'm focusing and there's only time, and it's the thing that and because I'm really interested in the Sudanese story, I didn't focus very much at all on sort of Soviet patronage. But the story of Soviet patronage sometimes involves the same people, which is also a thing. When I started realizing that the same people who were going to Congress for Cultural Freedom events were going to Afro-Asian Writers Bureau meetings. And Ngugi wa Thiong'o's, or James Ngugi as he was known at the time, his first novel is published because he wins a novel prize at the Congress for Cultural Freedom sponsored first Conference of African Writers on African Soil at Makerere in 1962 conference. He then wins the Lotus Prize from the Afro-Asian Writers Bureau later. So it's like, there is really, and in a way, Ngugi is someone who definitely disavows the former. There are other people who, in actually a certain kind of version of non-alignment, took money from whoever would give it to them, because it's actually hard to make things. And at the time, the sort of Cold War state, international state, there was sort of like, there were two international endowments for the arts. And you could try to find ways to get money to do projects. So I don't want to sound naive about it myself. it's just more that because I actually think, because there were many lives that were just, I mean, leaving aside the political context, or as if that word was delimitable, but there were many cultural lives. I mean, the Taufik Saig did not survive this story. And Rajat Nyogi, who founded Transition, I mean, he didn't die, he was broken by this story. So there are casualties all over, and that's actually, my work on this is sort of designed to actually tell a kind of group biography of the editors of these journals.
At which point we have to end. What's quite beautiful is we're going to go from magazines to meanwhile, and actually there's almost the notion of the editorial, I think will reappear in the next session. So will you join in, please, thanking Michael Vazquez.